Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. At that time, I had been living in my house for about 7 years. I don't own some fancy villa, but it's my private home, and I take pride in it. I'd describe myself as a law-abiding person who respects the rights of others. My neighbor, whom I'll call Frank, has always been a crafty guy. He always tries to get something new without losing anything of his own or paying for it. We occasionally exchanged greetings, and sometimes we had brief interactions on social media, but for the most part we barely talked, which was perfectly fine with me. One afternoon, I noticed that construction workers were digging deep trenches that encroached on my property. I quickly went outside. "Hey, Frank!" I shouted across the yard, waving my arms to get his attention. He walked over, sipping water, pretending like he didn't see me. Eventually, he responded, and with a puzzled look asked what was going on. "Why are you digging on my property? You've clearly gone way beyond your lot line." Frank, acting as if nothing happened, replied, "Oh, I thought you wouldn't mind. I'm building a new garage. I need more space. And you don't even use this part of your yard." I couldn't believe my ears. Did he really just say that? Wouldn't mind? Of course I mind. You can't build on my land without my permission. Frank just sighed and waved to the workers to stop what they were doing. It seemed like everything was resolved. Nope, that was just the beginning. A few days later, I started noticing strange things on my property. First, there were issues with the construction of my patio. When I hired a contractor to lay the foundation, I was informed that the local planning department had blocked the project. Someone had filed a complaint claiming my project violated local building codes. I immediately knew Frank was behind it. I went to him again. "Frank, did you file a complaint with the planning department about my project?" He just smiled, leaning against his fence as if nothing was wrong. "Well, technically, your project is off by a couple of inches. I'm just being a responsible neighbor trying to improve our neighborhood." This guy had the nerve to invade my property and then tried to sabotage my construction plans out of sheer spite. I wasn't going to stand for it. I called the planning department and explained the situation. It turned out that Frank had filed multiple complaints against me, each one more ridiculous than the last. I was furious, but instead of yelling or starting a verbal argument, I decided to take the high road. That evening, I reviewed all the paperwork regarding the boundaries of my property, building permits, and local regulations. I even hired a surveyor to double-check the property lines. And you know what I found? It turns out Frank's house was built too close to the edge of his lot, violating setback regulations. He had been breaking local building codes for years, and yet here he was preaching about integrity and doing things by the book. Armed with all the facts, I filed my own complaints with all the relevant authorities, not just with the planning department, but also with the HOA, which had strict rules about construction. It turned out Frank's plans for his massive garage were completely out of line. He hadn't submitted the proper permits, and no one was happy about it. After Frank and his workers stopped digging on my land, they continued digging on his. Then things got interesting. One day, a crew arrived on Frank's property, not to help him build the garage, but to issue a stop work order. Frank tried to argue with them, but it didn't work. The local authorities took his repeated violations seriously, especially after learning he had interfered with my project out of sheer pettiness. And to top it off, I made my final move. I called 911. I explained how Frank had attempted to illegally encroach on my land and obstruct my construction. The police arrived to settle the dispute, but Frank's arrogance didn't help him. He started yelling at the officers, insisting he had the right to build wherever he wanted. Bad idea. Frank received several fines for illegal construction and boundary violations. His garage project was completely shut down, and he was forced to pay for the damages to my private yard. On top of that, he had to tear down part of his house that had been illegally over the property line for years. Before the next story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Let's move on to the next story. I took a job at a bakery chain. I won't name the place, but let's just say bread is part of their brand. They also sell overpriced salads and sandwiches, but that's beside the point. I worked there for about a year, during which I had the misfortune of dealing with a boss named Emily. That's not her real name, of course, but I'm sure you get the picture. Emily and I were like oil and water. It didn't help that she got the previous general manager to quit after having an affair with him, then threatening to tell his wife if he didn't leave. He left quietly, and Emily stepped into the manager's role. I didn't care for her, but I had to acknowledge her sheer determination to secure such a small-time position by any means necessary. When I first started, I kept it professional and respectful, like any new employee should. But Emily had a way of getting under my skin. For example, I would finish all the tasks I was hired to do, cleaning up and maintaining my station, and then take a short breather once everything was done. As a cashier, if there were no customers, I had nothing else to handle. But Emily would storm out of the back office, her voice shrill as she barked, "Why aren't you working?" I'd calmly explain that I'd finished my tasks and was just waiting for the next customer. She would glare at me, then, accidentally, knock over an entire pot of brewed coffee onto the freshly cleaned floor, leaving me to mop it up again. I quickly learned that I always needed to look busy, even if there was nothing left to do. Emily made it pretty clear early on that she didn't appreciate people who didn't grovel at her feet. Once she realized I wasn't going to fall in line and kiss the ground she walked on, my hours started disappearing. The store ran like a medieval court, with promotions and raises handed out based on favoritism, not merit. Unsurprisingly, Emily's friends all got the manager positions, and they made life difficult for the rest of us. One of the most annoying things Emily did was barely showing up for work. She'd drive to the store, clock in just to make it seem like she was working, and then disappear. It wasn't just about the principal. She was stealing hours, plain and simple. When you clocked in, the system printed a little receipt with the time, and Emily would often just leave them lying around. Since I was the one constantly cleaning up, I started pocketing these stubs without even thinking about it. Little did I know those scraps of paper would become important later. Did I mention that Emily was racist? She was white, while most of the staff were high school kids like me, mainly people of color. One day she stepped out and in front of everyone declared, "When you're on the clock, I own you." We all stared at her, stunned by what she'd just said. Realizing how bad it sounded, she quickly backtracked, trying to explain, "I didn't mean it like that," but the damage was done, and the memory of that moment would come back to haunt her. Eventually, I had enough. I was fed up with having to beg for hours, so I started looking for another job. When I found one, I decided to drop my hours at the bakery, but things took an odd turn. As soon as I told Emily I had another job, she did something she had never done before. She scheduled me to work every single day for an entire week. This had never happened, even when we were on relatively neutral terms. I told her I couldn't do it because of my new job, but it was like she was going out of her way to make things difficult for me. That night, I called my friend, who still worked there, to let him know that I was going to quit the next day. Unfortunately, my friend has this bad habit of putting his phone on speaker when he's cleaning at work, so Emily overheard the entire conversation. The next day, I walked into the store, ready to quit on my own terms. I planned to be respectful, say my thanks, and walk away. I got through my whole speech, thanks for the opportunity and all that, when Emily cut me off. "Oh yeah," she said, not even looking at me. "I was meaning to tell you, you're fired." I was so caught off guard, so blindsided, that I lost it. I cussed her out on the spot. My mom always taught me to treat women with respect, but this woman, this arrogant, self-important, overbearing figure who thought binge eating was a personality, had pushed me too far. I stormed out, angry that she had fired me before I could quit, but I decided to let it go. I was 18, I had another job lined up, and it wasn't like I expected Emily to give me a glowing reference anyway. I would have completely moved on, except for what happened next. That same evening, I got a text from the district manager, Ben. He hadn't been told I was fired and assumed I was still working there. I explained the situation, and to my surprise, he was furious. He asked why Emily had fired me, and when I told him the story, he was livid. He clarified that I had been fired before I had the chance to quit, and I confirmed it. Then Ben asked if there was anything else he needed to know about Emily. Boy, was there. I let it all out. The lies, the manipulation, the racism. I even mentioned how Emily was always clocking in and out while barely being at the store. Ben listened intently and asked if anyone else could back me up. I explained that Emily had systematically pushed people out of the store, firing or forcing most of them to quit and replacing them with her friends. But I knew a few people who might be willing to corroborate my story. And then I remembered Andy. Andy, one of my coworkers, fancied himself the next big social media star. He was always filming or recording everything, hoping to catch some funny or viral moment. His content was beyond cringe, but his habit of documenting everything turned out to be our goldmine. Andy had audio recordings, carefully labeled by date, and when he checked, he found it. Emily's racist remarks captured in all their unedited glory. With Andy's recording in hand, I knew we had something that could really put Emily in hot water. But I wasn't satisfied with just getting her fired for her racist remarks. I wanted to dig deeper. Emily had made life miserable for so many people, and I felt like this was my chance to set things right. I talked to a few of my former coworkers, those who had either been fired or forced to quit, and we decided to scour through Andy's countless recordings. It was tedious work, but after a few long evenings of going through clips, we found more than just her racist comments. There were recordings of Emily saying some pretty nasty things about the customers, about the staff, and about the way she handled the food. One particularly shocking moment was when a customer sneezed on some baked goods in the display case. A coworker pointed it out to Emily, but instead of tossing the contaminated pastries, she laughed it off and said, "No one will notice, just leave it." The fact that she had such disregard for basic health and safety standards made my blood boil. But as much as that disgusted me, it still didn't feel like enough. I wanted to hit her where it hurt. That's when I decided to take a deeper dive into Emily's personal life. I knew from bits and pieces of gossip that she had been having an affair with a previous manager, but no one had ever really questioned what Emily was up to outside of work. I figured it wouldn't hurt to do a little sleuthing. With some quick online searches, I managed to find her Facebook profile. It wasn't locked down, so I got a pretty good glimpse into her personal life, and what I found surprised me. Emily was married. This was a bombshell because no one at work had ever mentioned it. Emily never wore a wedding ring, and she never spoke about her husband. In fact, she had been so brazen about her affair with the previous manager, I was almost sure she had to be single. But no, there it was in plain sight. Emily was living a double life. I figured if her husband didn't already know about her infidelity, it was only a matter of time before it caught up to her. But it didn't stop there. Curious, I decided to track down the old manager, Mark, who had quit after Emily blackmailed him. I found his Facebook profile easily enough, and I noticed that he and his wife were now separated. A few quick messages later, I had the full story. After Mark quit, Emily had continued to blackmail him for money. When he refused to pay up, she followed through on her threat and told his wife about the affair, which led to their separation. Mark was understandably bitter about the whole thing, and he was still dealing with the fallout from his marriage falling apart. As we chatted, I brought up the fact that blackmail and extortion were serious crimes in our state, with penalties that could include up to 7 years in prison and hefty fines. Mark's ears perked up at that. We hatched a plan. Mark agreed to press charges against Emily for extortion, but I asked him to hold off for just a little while. I wanted to make sure everything was in place before we pulled the trigger. He agreed to give me a week. I immediately contacted District Manager Ben and arranged a meeting. When we met, I laid everything out for him: the recordings of Emily's racist comments, the written statements from my former coworkers, and the clock-in slips I had been collecting that showed she was stealing hours. Ben was shocked, but he was also grateful. I handed over the evidence and he assured me that he would take action. A few days later, I noticed something odd. The bakery was closed in the middle of the day, something that almost never happened. I texted a friend who still worked there, and he filled me in on what had gone down. After reviewing the evidence I'd provided, Ben decided to dig a little deeper. He checked the security cameras to see if Emily had been working the hours she claimed. Of course, she hadn't. That was just the tip of the iceberg, though. Ben started looking into the store's financial records, and that's when things got really bad for Emily. Turns out, she wasn't just stealing hours. She was stealing money, too. My friend didn't have all the details, but apparently, Emily had been skimming off the top for a while. She was also using the store's budget for personal expenses like repairs on her car and other things that had nothing to do with the business. Once Ben discovered this, he fired Emily on the spot. And not just her, he fired all of her friends who had been part of her little management clique. With almost no one left to run the store, they had to shut down temporarily to clean up the mess Emily had left behind, both literally and figuratively. But Emily's problems didn't end there. Remember how I found out she was married? Well, I passed that information along to Mark. Armed with screenshots of Emily's online activity and the knowledge of her ongoing affair, he reached out to her husband and let him know everything. To make matters worse, Mark presented it in a way that made it seem like Emily was still actively cheating. As you can imagine, her husband flipped out. Within days, Emily's marriage was in shambles, and she was on the verge of losing everything. She made the mistake of airing her dirty laundry on Facebook, begging her friends and family for support. But, unsurprisingly, most of them abandoned her. By this point, Emily was living in her car, struggling to figure out her next move. That's when Mark dropped the final bombshell. He pressed charges for extortion. Emily was now facing a serious legal battle with no money and no friends to back her up. On top of that, the company decided to sue her for the money she had stolen and for all the expenses they incurred while cleaning up the store and dealing with her mess. Emily's life had spiraled completely out of control. I heard bits and pieces about what happened in court. According to Mark, she broke down crying multiple times during the hearings, realizing how deeply she had messed up. By the end of it, she was forced to sell her car at a huge loss just to pay her legal fees. Last I heard, Emily was staying with her sister, who didn't exactly welcome her with open arms. It's hard to imagine how things could have gone any worse for her, but in a way, it was poetic justice. All of this could have been avoided if she had just let me quit in peace. After Emily's life completely fell apart, I couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and disbelief at how far things had escalated. It all started with something so small, a few unfair hours, some nasty remarks, but it spiraled into a chain of events that destroyed her career, her personal relationships, and her reputation. I didn't go into this situation looking for revenge, but Emily's arrogance and cruelty had driven me to see things through to the bitter end. As time passed, I moved on with my life. My new job was going well, and I didn't give much thought to the bakery anymore, aside from the occasional text from my former coworkers filling me in on the latest gossip. The store eventually reopened, but with a skeleton crew and new management. Ben had taken over temporarily, cleaning house and trying to get the place back on track after Emily's disastrous reign. Apparently, corporate wasn't too happy with how things had been handled at the store level, and there were whispers of more changes coming down from the top. It seemed like everyone involved with Emily's little circle was either fired or transferred to other locations. I didn't feel bad for them. They had all played a part in making the workplace toxic, and they had gotten what was coming to them. It felt like justice had been served, not just for me, but for all the other people Emily had wronged over the years. I heard that a few of her former friends tried to reach out to her, but by then, she had burned too many bridges. People had no reason to stick their necks out for someone who had made their lives miserable. One day, about a month after everything had gone down, I ran into Andy at a local coffee shop. We hadn't seen each other since the whole ordeal with Emily, and it was a little weird at first. He looked almost sheepish, like he wasn't sure what to say. I could tell he still felt awkward about the fact that his constant recording habit had played a big role in bringing Emily down. After all, it wasn't his intention to become the key witness in a workplace scandal. "Hey, man," Andy said, sitting down across from me. "I just wanted to talk about, everything that happened." I nodded, taking a sip of my drink. "Yeah, it was pretty wild. How have you been?" Good, good, he said, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. I don't know. I didn't expect things to go that far. I thought I was just recording stuff for my vlog, but then it turned into, I smiled. "Yeah, I get it. Honestly, though, your recordings really helped. Without them, Emily would have probably gotten away with everything. She deserved what she got." Andy shifted in his seat, looking relieved. "Yeah, I guess you're right. It's just crazy how fast it all went downhill for her. I didn't think she was going to end up living out of her car." I shrugged. "She made her bed, man. Nobody forced her to act the way she did." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us reflecting on how much had changed since we worked at the bakery. Finally, Andy spoke up again. "So what's next for you? You sticking with your new job, or you got bigger plans?" I leaned back in my chair, thinking about the future. I'm happy where I am for now, but I've been thinking about going to college once I'm done with school. Maybe study something like business or management. Make sure I don't end up like Emily." Andy chuckled. "Good call. I don't think anyone wants to end up like her." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, and eventually, we went our separate ways. But as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's story wasn't completely over. I hadn't heard anything about her in weeks, and a part of me wondered what she was doing now. Was she still living with her sister, struggling to find a new job? Or had she managed to claw her way back, somehow rebuilding the life she had so thoroughly destroyed? I got my answer sooner than I expected. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through social media when I saw a post from Mark. He didn't post often, so I was curious to see what it was about. It turned out to be an update on Emily's legal situation. The lawsuit for extortion had finally gone to trial, and Mark had posted about the outcome. As it turned out, Emily had pleaded guilty to the charges, hoping to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. She didn't get the full 7 years she could have faced, but she did get a hefty fine and a year of probation. Her financial situation was already a mess, and this was just another nail in the coffin. Reading the post, I felt a strange sense of closure. Emily's downfall had been swift and brutal, but it was also a cautionary tale. She had pushed too many people too far, and in the end, her own actions had led to her undoing. It wasn't just about the stolen hours, the racism, or the manipulation. It was about how she treated people. Her cruelty and arrogance had caught up with her, and there was no escaping the consequences. As for me, life moved on. I continued working, saving up for college, and thinking about what the future might hold. The bakery job had been just a small chapter in my life, but it had taught me a lot about people, about power, responsibility, and how quickly things could spiral out of control. Emily's story was over, but mine was just beginning. And honestly, I couldn't be more relieved to have left that part of my life behind. Thank you for watching.